In 1870, somewhere in the hill country of central Texas, an 11-year-old farm boy walked out to check on his family's sheep. By sunset, he would begin a journey that would take him further from everything he knew than most people travel in a lifetime. Not in miles necessarily, but in who he would become. 40 years later, that same person would stand in front of a cheering crowd at a Texas rodeo, demonstrating skills that seemed to belong to another century entirely. The people watching couldn't quite believe what they were seeing, and honestly, neither could he sometimes. His name was Herman Lehman, and his story is one of the most extraordinary tales of survival and transformation the American frontier ever produced. Tonight, we're going to walk through what life was actually like out there, on the edge of everything, where the rules you grew up with simply stopped applying. So if you're settling in for the night and these stories help you drift off, consider subscribing. I'm always curious where everyone's listening from. If you're in New York or London or somewhere in between, drop a comment with your city. There's something kind of wonderful about knowing people across the Atlantic are hearing the same story at the same time. Well, not exactly the same time. Time zones and all that. But you know what I mean? All right. The American frontier, get yourself comfortable first. Seriously, take a second. Adjust your pillows if you need to. Pull your blanket up a little, because we're going somewhere fascinating tonight, and you're going to want to be settled in. Picture Central Texas in 1870. It's May. The air is warm but not yet brutal. The kind of warmth that makes you drowsy in the afternoon if you sit still too long. The Lehman family has a small farm out near Mason, about 100 miles northwest of San Antonio. If you've never been to that part of Texas, imagine rolling hills dotted with oak trees, limestone outcroppings, and grass that goes golden in the summer. Pretty country, actually. The kind of place where you can see for miles. Herman was the third of 8 children. His father had passed when he was young, and his mother Augusta had remarried a man named Philip Buchmeyer. They weren't wealthy, but they had land, livestock, and each other. A solid frontier family doing what frontier families did, working hard, hoping for rain, keeping an eye on the horizon. And that last part was important, because this was Comanche territory. Now, here's something you might not know. The Comanche weren't originally from Texas at all. They'd migrated down from the Rocky Mountains, pushed out by stronger tribes in the north. For generations, they'd barely survived, scraping by, always on the move, always hungry. Then they encountered horses. The Spanish had brought horses to the Americas in the 1500s, and they guarded them carefully. They understood, maybe better than anyone, what would happen if the native tribes learned to ride. But over time, through trades and raids and escaped animals, horses spread across the plains, and something remarkable happened when the Comanche got hold of them. They didn't just learn to ride, they became arguably the finest light cavalry on the planet. Within a few generations, they transformed from a struggling mountain tribe into the dominant force across a territory larger than most European countries. They called themselves Numanu, the people. Everyone else called them Comanche, which roughly translates to those who fight us all the time, which honestly, fair. The point is, in 1870, the hill country where Herman Lehman lived was right on the edge of Comanche territory, and the Comanche had been raiding settlements in Texas for decades, sometimes for horses, sometimes for supplies, sometimes for captives, especially children. Now, I want you to understand something about captive taking on the frontier. It wasn't random cruelty. It served a practical purpose. The Comanche, like many plains tribes, had suffered tremendous population losses from European diseases, smallpox, cholera, measles, things they had no immunity to. Taking captives, especially young captives who could be adopted into the tribe, was a way of maintaining their numbers. It doesn't make what happened to those children any less traumatic, but it helps explain why it happened at all. On May 16th, 1870, Herman and his younger brother Willie were sent out to watch the family's sheep and chase crows away from the cornfield. Normal farm kid stuff. They were maybe a few hundred yards from the house, close enough that they could see the chimney smoke. Then the riders appeared, about a dozen of them, coming over a small ridge at full speed. Herman would later remember the sound before he saw them. Hoofbeats, then war cries, then everything moving very, very fast. He tried to fight. He was 11 years old, and he tried to fight grown men on horseback. That tells you something about who Herman Lehman was even then. One of the warriors, a man named Carnavist, struck him over the head with a pistol. When Herman's vision cleared, he was already tied to a horse, and his home was disappearing behind him. His brother Willie fell off a horse during the initial escape and somehow found his way back home. When they asked him where Herman was, all Willie could say was, "Herman has gone on, Mama. They took him on." He had no idea how right he was. The first days were, frankly, awful. Herman was badly sunburned, dehydrated, half-starved, and terrified. The raiding party moved constantly, travelling mostly at night to avoid pursuit. They crossed terrain that seemed to go on forever. Flat, empty, the kind of landscape where you can watch someone approaching for an hour before they reach you. At one point, Carnavist killed a calf they encountered, cut it open, and forced Herman's head into the still warm stomach cavity, made him drink the curdled milk from inside. Herman vomited. Carnavist beat him and made him eat what he'd thrown up. I'm telling you this not to be graphic, but because it's important for understanding what came next. Herman Lehman, at 11 years old, was being broken down. Every comfort he'd ever known was gone. His family might as well have been on another planet. The rules of his childhood no longer applied, and at some point during those first terrible weeks, something in Herman's mind shifted. He made a decision. If they wanted him to be Comanche, then by God he would become Comanche. He would become the best Comanche he could possibly be, not to escape, not to survive until rescue came, but because, in that moment, on that endless plain, it was the only thing that made any sense. Now, this might seem strange to us, aligning yourself with your captors. But here's the thing about the human mind, especially a young human mind. It's remarkably adaptable, and when your old reality is completely destroyed, sometimes the only option is to build a new one. Plus, Carnavista told Herman that his entire family had been killed during the raid, that there was no home to go back to. This wasn't true, but Herman believed it for years. The Comanche who had captured Herman were part of a band led by a chief named Quahadi. Over the following months, Herman was put to work. Hard work, carrying water, tending horses, scraping hides. He was essentially a slave at first, the lowest member of the tribal hierarchy. But he watched everything, and he learned. He learned how to track animals across ground that seemed to leave no marks. He learned how to read the weather by watching cloud formations and feeling the wind. He learned which plants were edible and which would kill you. He learned how to make fire without matches, how to find water in dry country, how to move silently through brush. And he learned how to fight. The Comanche fighting style was unlike anything Herman had ever seen. They could ride at full gallop, swing down along the side of their horse for cover, and fire arrows under the animal's neck. They could shoot 6 arrows in the time it took a soldier to reload a single-shot rifle. They were, in a very real sense, the most effective guerrilla fighters on the continent. Herman absorbed all of it. And something else happened too. Something that even he struggled to explain later in life. He started to enjoy it. The freedom of the plains, the closeness of the tribal community, the sheer physical skill required to survive. After the initial brutality, life with the Comanche wasn't all misery. There were feasts after successful hunts. There were stories told around fires at night. There was, in its own way, a kind of family. This is the part of frontier history that makes people uncomfortable. The idea that some captives didn't want to be rescued, that they found something in their new lives that their old lives couldn't offer. But it happened. More often than we like to admit. Herman's adopted family began treating him differently as he proved himself. He was given better food, warmer clothing, eventually his own horse. He went from slave to student to, gradually, something like a son. Carnaviste, the man who had captured him, who had beaten him and force-fed him that first awful night, became Herman's adopted father. And when Carnaviste was killed in a raid about a year after Herman's capture, Herman was devastated. He was also furious, because the person who killed Carnaviste wasn't a Texas soldier or a ranger. It was another member of their own tribe, a medicine man who Carnaviste had argued with. And Herman, now about 12 years old, decided to do something about it. He found the medicine man, he confronted him, and he killed him. A 12-year-old boy killing a grown man, in retribution for the death of the person who had kidnapped him. Try to hold both of those facts in your mind at once, because that's what the frontier was, a place where categories like victim and perpetrator, family and captor got all tangled up together. Nothing was simple, nothing was clean. People contained multitudes, and those multitudes didn't always make sense. The psychology of it is fascinating, actually. Modern researchers have a term for what Herman experienced. They call it traumatic bonding. When you're completely dependent on someone for survival, your brain starts to form attachments to them. It's not weakness. It's not Stockholm Syndrome exactly, though that's related. It's just what human brains do when placed in impossible situations, and Herman's situation was about as impossible as they come. After the killing, Herman had to flee. You couldn't kill a medicine man without consequences. The spiritual power they held, the respect they commanded, meant that even justified killings would be avenged. So he ran to a different band, a band led by a chief whose name would become famous across Texas, Quanah Parker. Quanah was the son of a Comanche chief and a white woman named Cynthia Ann Parker, who had herself been captured as a child and fully assimilated into Comanche life. He was, in a sense, a symbol of everything that made the frontier so complicated, part of two worlds, belonging fully to neither, or maybe, depending on how you looked at it, both. Herman found acceptance with Quanah's people, and for the next several years he lived as a Comanche warrior, fully, completely. He participated in raids. He counted coup against enemies. He learned to hunt buffalo, which was far more dangerous than you might think. Those animals weigh up to 2,000 pounds and can pivot faster than a horse. Getting close enough to kill one with a bow and arrow required incredible skill and courage, and Herman became good at it. Really good. The thing about survival is that it changes you, not just in the obvious ways like learning new skills or adapting to new circumstances. It changes how you see yourself. Herman Lehman had been a Texas farm boy for 11 years. By the time he was 15, that boy felt like a stranger. someone from a half-remembered dream. He thought in Comanche. He dreamed in Comanche. When he imagined his future, it was a Comanche future, riding the plains, raising a family, growing old in a buffalo hide lodge surrounded by his grandchildren. That's what the frontier could do. Take a child and remake him entirely. There's a particular detail from Herman's later accounts that I keep coming back to. He talks about killing wolves and drinking their blood. The Comanche believed this would transfer the wolf's qualities to you: speed, endurance, cunning. Years later, when Herman stood in that rodeo arena demonstrating traditional hunting techniques, people who watched him said there was something different about his eyes, the way he moved, like there was a wildness in him that 50 years of civilization couldn't fully erase. Maybe the wolf blood was just superstition. Maybe it was something else entirely, a kind of commitment, a way of saying, I am fully, completely this thing now. Whatever it was, Herman Lehman survived, and in surviving he became something entirely new. The frontier demanded that of people, transformation or death. Often there was no middle ground, and this was just one story, one boy. Across hundreds of thousands of square miles and nearly a century of conflict, there were countless others, each one finding their own way to adapt, to survive, to become whatever they needed to become. The sun is setting now over the Texas hill country in our story. The first stars are appearing one by one in a sky that seems impossibly vast. You forget, living in the modern world, how many stars there actually are. Out here, away from any electric light, the sky is practically crowded with them. The Milky Way stretches overhead like a river of light. Somewhere out on the plains, a 15-year-old Herman Lehman is riding back toward camp after a successful hunt. His horse is tired. He's tired too, that pleasant kind of exhausted you get after hard physical work. The smell of sage and dry grass fills the air. There's a cooling breeze coming down from the northwest, carrying the first hint that summer won't last forever. Behind him, the hills are going purple in the fading light. Ahead, he can see the faint glow of campfires. His people, his home now. He doesn't think about Texas farms anymore. Doesn't think about his mother or his siblings, who he believes are dead anyway. When he sleeps tonight, rolled in buffalo robes beside a dying fire, he'll dream in Comanche, of horses and hunts and the endless grasslands that have become his entire world. The frontier was hard on everyone who ventured into it. But here's the strange thing. It was also, in its way, beautiful. The sunsets that painted the whole sky orange and red. The silence of the prairie at night, broken only by coyote calls and the whisper of wind through grass. The closeness of communities that depended on each other absolutely. Tonight there will be meat. The camp will smell of roasting buffalo, the fat crackling and dripping into the fire. Stories will be told. Children will fall asleep listening to their elders. Somewhere, someone will be singing the old songs. Tomorrow brings whatever tomorrow brings. But for right now, in this moment, Herman Lehman is alive. He belongs somewhere. He has purpose. And on the frontier, that was everything. The stars continue their slow wheel overhead. The campfires burn low, and across thousands of miles of wild country, countless other survival stories are unfolding, each one unique, each one demanding everything from the people living it. We'll get to more of them. But for now, let's stay here a little longer, in this quiet moment, under these endless stars, where even the most brutal chapter of frontier life could contain, somehow, moments of peace. Herman wasn't the only one learning hard lessons out there on the frontier. All across the American West, people were figuring out day by day what it actually took to stay alive. And some of those lessons were absolutely wild. Take Kit Carson. You've probably heard the name. By 1846, Carson was already famous. Mountain man. Guide. The kind of person they wrote newspaper articles about back east. But in December of that year, out in the Southern California desert, Kit Carson found himself in a situation that would have killed just about anyone else. Here's what happened. Carson was with a group of American soldiers and Marines, about 150 of them, who just fought a nasty battle against Mexican cavalry near San Diego. The Americans had won, technically, but they'd taken heavy losses, 18 dead, dozens more wounded so badly they couldn't walk, and now they were trapped. The Mexican forces had surrounded them on a small rocky hill. No way out, almost no water, food running low. The injured men were starting to show signs of infection because, well, this was 1846 and antibiotics wouldn't exist for another century. Someone had to go for help. Someone had to sneak through the Mexican lines, travel 30 miles through hostile desert, and reach the American-held port at San Diego. Carson volunteered, along with a young Navy lieutenant named Edward Beale and a Diegueño native guide named Camuca. They waited until nightfall. Then they started crawling. I want you to picture this. 3 men, flat on their bellies in the dark, inching across rocky desert ground. They couldn't bring their metal canteens because the sloshing would make too much noise, so they took one long drink of water and left all their supplies behind. Then Carson and Beale discovered their boots were too loud on the rocks, so they took them off, tucked them into their belts, and kept crawling barefoot. They crawled, right past Mexican sentries. At one point, a soldier on horseback stopped maybe 15 feet from where Carson lay frozen against the ground. The soldier lit a cigarette, sat there smoking it, enjoying the quiet night, just taking his time. Carson pressed his ear to the dirt and lay absolutely still. And that's when he heard something strange. A rhythmic thumping, coming from nearby. It was Lieutenant Beale's heartbeat. The young officer was so terrified that Carson could actually hear his heart pounding through the ground. Beale whispered that they should jump up and fight. Carson just told him to stay down. They'd been in worse spots before. The Mexican soldier finished his cigarette and rode off. Carson and his companions kept moving. Somewhere in all that crawling, their boots came loose from their belts and disappeared into the darkness. No time to go back and look. So now they were facing a 30-mile trek through cactus country. Barefoot. They split up to reduce the chances of all 3 being caught, each man taking a different route towards San Diego. Carson, being Carson, took the longest and most dangerous path. He walked through the night. He walked through the next day. He walked through another night, stepping on prickly pear cactus, stepping on rocks, stepping on God knows what else in the darkness. When he finally staggered into the American camp outside San Diego, his feet were so destroyed he could barely stand. It took him over a week to walk normally again. In his memoirs, Carson wrote about the whole thing in maybe 2 sentences. Said they finally got through, but had the misfortune of losing their shoes. Had to travel over country covered with prickly pear and rocks barefoot. The misfortune of losing their shoes. That's how Kit Carson described one of the most grueling survival treks in American military history. Meanwhile, the men back on that rocky hill had spent days eating their mules. Actually eating them. Starting with the weakest animals, stewing the meat into a thin, greasy soup that some of the men couldn't even keep down. They dug holes in the sandy ground to find any moisture that might have soaked in from recent rain, squeezed the wet soil through cloth to get drops of muddy water, and then, just when they were about to attempt a desperate march towards San Diego on their own, relief forces arrived. Carson had made it. All three of them had made it, actually, though Beale and Kamuka were in such bad shape they had to be carried onto a ship in San Diego Harbor. The hill where those soldiers had survived became a local landmark. People started calling it Mule Hill, for obvious reasons. Now, here's the thing. While Carson was crawling barefoot through the California desert that December, something even worse was happening about 500 miles to the north, in the Sierra Nevada mountains, where a group of settlers had made a catastrophic mistake and were about to pay for it in ways that still make people shudder 170 years later. You know the name? The Donner Party. 87 people had left Missouri that spring headed for California. Families mostly. Men, women and children looking for a new life out west. More than half of them were kids. The youngest was just a few months old. They were running late. It happens on the trail. Broken wagons, sick animals, rivers that take longer to cross than you planned. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada mountains, it was already October. Late October. Winter was coming, and the passes would soon be snowed shut. Then they made the decision that would doom them. A man named Lansford Hastings had published a book claiming there was a shortcut through the Utah desert. It would save them weeks, he said, get them to California before the snow flew. The shortcut was a lie. Hastings had never actually travelled the route himself. He'd just looked at a map and assumed it would work. It didn't. The so-called shortcut added nearly a month to their journey. By the time they reached the eastern base of the Sierras, it was early November, and then the snow came. Not a little snow, not a normal snowfall. 20 feet of snow, maybe more. Drifts so deep you couldn't see the first-floor windows of the cabins they built. If you go to the site today, you can see old trees with their trunks cut off 20 feet in the air. That's where the Donner Party cut them down, because that's where the snow level was. Only 2 or 3 feet of trunk sticking up above the white. They were trapped, all 87 of them, for months. At first they thought rescue would come. Someone would notice they hadn't arrived. Someone would send help. They rationed their food carefully, made plans, tried to stay positive, but the snow kept falling, and the weeks kept passing, and nobody came. The food ran out fast. They killed and ate their livestock. Then they boiled the hides, cut strips of oxhide and boiled them until they got a thin, flavourless goo. They'd line the children up and put a spoonful in each mouth. Try not to watch the kids gag. When the hides ran out, they ate bark, ate twigs, ate their shoes, ate anything that might have calories, and then they started dying. The men went first, mostly. Their bodies burned through calories faster, doing the heavy work of cutting wood and trying to dig paths through the snow. One by one, they weakened, stopped getting up, stopped breathing. And then the survivors faced the choice that would haunt them forever. They started eating the dead. This is the part of the story that made them famous, the part that still gives people nightmares. But here's something most people don't know. The survivors didn't start eating each other casually. They held out as long as they possibly could. Some of them died rather than resort to cannibalism. The ones who did eat human flesh, most of them did it to keep their children alive. They marked the bodies carefully so no one would accidentally eat their own family members. There's something almost noble about that in a horrible way. Rules, even at the end of everything. lines they still wouldn't cross, most of them anyway. Then there was Louis Kieseberg. When the rescue parties finally made it through in the spring of 1847, they found Kieseberg alone in his cabin, surrounded by human remains, a cooking pot nearby with what looked like fresh liver. They asked him what happened to the others. He said they'd all died. When they asked about Mrs. Donner specifically, he said she'd gotten lost in the snow one night and died. He'd made her a cup of coffee and put her to bed, but she was dead by morning. Then they asked about the contents of his cooking pot. Kieseberg said, "Yeah, that was Mrs. Donner," and he said something else that the rescue party never forgot. He said he hadn't eaten the beef they'd left for him on a previous trip because, and this is a direct quote, human meat was not as sweet. He said the liver was the tastiest part. I'm not making this up. This is in the historical record. Multiple eyewitnesses. Kieseberg lived for another 50 years after that. Spent the rest of his life being whispered about, being avoided. He tried to sue a newspaper once for calling him a cannibal. He lost. The site where all this happened is a California state park now. There's a monument, a museum. They changed the name of the lake from Truckee Lake to Donner Lake, as if the name itself needed to carry the weight of what happened there. 41 of the 87 people died. More than half of the dead were men. The women and children survived at higher rates, maybe because the men did more physical labor and burned through their calories faster, or maybe because the women were more willing to do what had to be done to keep their children alive. Nobody really knows. But here's what gets me about the Donner Party. They weren't weak people. They weren't stupid people. They were ordinary families who made one bad decision based on bad information. Trusted the wrong book, took the wrong shortcut, and the wilderness showed them exactly how unforgiving it could be. The frontier didn't care about your intentions, didn't care how hard you'd worked or how much you deserved to make it. It just was indifferent, enormous, waiting to kill you if you made a mistake. But enough about death. Let's go back to Herman. He was becoming something of a legend himself, at least within his adopted tribe. By his late teens, he'd participated in dozens of raids, counted coup against enemies, earned a reputation as someone who didn't scare easily. The thing about Comanche survival wasn't just about individual toughness. It was about knowing when to rely on others, when to trust people you might not normally trust, when to accept help from unexpected places. A raid wasn't a bunch of individuals doing their own thing. It was a coordinated operation. Scouts went ahead. Flankers protected the sides. Everyone knew their role. And when things went wrong, which they did plenty, the group stuck together. Herman learned this on his first real raid into Mexican territory. They were after horses mostly. The Comanche always needed horses. A warrior's wealth was measured in how many he owned. A young man looking to marry needed horses to offer as gifts to his bride's family. So they rode south, past the Rio Grande, into country where the ranches were spread out and vulnerable. They travelled mostly at night, using the stars to navigate. During the day they rested in arroyos and dry creek beds, staying out of sight. Herman was nervous, though he tried not to show it. This wasn't practice anymore. This was real. People could die out here. The raid itself went fine. They hit a ranch just before dawn, got the horses, started driving them back north. The sun was just coming up when they spotted the dust cloud behind them. Mexican patrol. Way more men than they'd expected. Maybe 30 riders moving fast. Herman's instinct was to scatter, run, save himself. But the older warriors closed ranks, formed a moving defensive line, kept the horse herd moving while fighting off the patrol. They fired arrows from horseback with impossible accuracy, wheeling and turning like they'd been born in the saddle. It worked. They made it back across the river with most of the horses intact. One of the younger warriors took an arrow through his shoulder, but he was laughing about it by the time they made camp that night. That night, around the fire, one of the older men told Herman something he'd never forget. Alone, you survive today. Together, you survive tomorrow. There's detail from Herman's later accounts that says a lot about who he'd become. He talks about killing wolves and drinking their blood. The Comanche believed this would give you the wolf's qualities, its endurance, its cunning, its ability to survive where others couldn't. Herman did this multiple times, not because anyone forced him to, because he wanted those qualities, because he'd fully committed to being Comanche. Years later, people who met him would comment on his eyes, something different about them, a wildness that seemed out of place in a man wearing American clothes. Like part of him was still out there on the plains. The sky over the Comanche camp is full of stars now, the kind of darkness you don't see anymore unless you get way out from civilization. No light pollution, no glow on the horizon, just the moon and the stars and the endless sky. Herman is sleeping in a buffalo hide lodge with the flaps partially open to let in the breeze. The sounds of the camp are winding down, dogs settling, children's voices fading. Somewhere, an old woman is singing softly to herself. The lodge smells like wood smoke and tanned leather. A familiar smell now, comforting even. The buffalo robes he's wrapped in are soft and warm, worn smooth by years of use. Tomorrow there might be another raid, another hunt, another challenge to survive. But tonight, there's just this. Warmth and darkness and the slow rhythm of breathing. The crackle of a dying fire somewhere nearby. The distant hoot of an owl. The Comanche had a saying, "Every day above ground is a gift from the spirits." Herman understood that now. When you've seen what the world can do to a person, just being alive starts to feel like a miracle. Sleep comes easy out here when you're tired enough. And Herman Lehmann is very, very tired. His eyes close, his breathing slows, and the stars wheel overhead, the same stars that humans have been sleeping under since the beginning of time. Not everyone who survived the frontier did it by running. Some folks just flat out refused to back down no matter how bad the odds looked. Jack Hayes was one of those people. In the fall of 1841, Hayes was 24 years old and already making a name for himself with the Texas Rangers. He'd come down from Tennessee a few years earlier, missed the Texas Revolution by just a little bit, and spent the time since then doing what Rangers did. Patrolling the frontier, tracking raiders, getting into fights that most sensible people would have avoided entirely. Hayes was not a big man, about 5'6", slender build, the kind of quiet demeanour that made people underestimate him. He had this boyish face that made him look younger than he was, but his eyes told a different story. People who knew him said there was something in those eyes, a steadiness, like nothing in the world could shake him. On this particular day, Hayes was part of a surveying party working near a place called Enchanted Rock. If you've never been to Central Texas, Enchanted Rock is this massive pink granite dome rising up out of the hill country. You can see it from miles away. The local tribes considered it sacred ground. They said spirits lived inside the rock, that strange lights appeared there at night, that the stone itself would groan and creak as the sun went down. The surveying party was maybe 15 or 20 men. Their job was to mark out land grants, draw maps, figure out exactly who owned what in this newly claimed Texas territory. Boring work, mostly, but dangerous too, because this was Comanche country. Every man in that party knew the risks. Hayes got bored. I know that sounds strange, but that's what happened. While the other men were doing their surveying work, Hayes decided to ride out toward Enchanted Rock for a closer look. By himself, in the middle of Comanche territory. Look, I'm not saying this was smart, it wasn't. But Hayes had been doing this kind of thing for years and getting away with it. Maybe he'd started to believe his own reputation. Maybe he was just curious. Either way, he rode off alone toward that big pink rock. He was almost at the base of it when the war cries started. 30 Comanche warriors, maybe more, coming at him from the surrounding hills. They'd been watching the surveying party for days, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. One man, alone, far from help. Hayes had about 3 seconds to make a decision. He could try to outrun them back to the main party, but his horse was tired and theirs weren't. He could try to fight them on open ground, but that was 30 against 1, which even for Jack Hayes seemed like pushing it. So he did the only thing that made sense. He rode straight for Enchanted Rock, jumped off his horse, and started scrambling up the face of the granite dome. The Comanche were right behind him, arrows and musket balls cracking off the rock around him, war cries echoing off the stone. Hayes made it maybe 100 feet up before he found what he was looking for. A crack in the granite, a crevice just big enough to squeeze into and use as cover. He wedged himself in there with his back against the stone and his rifle pointed outward. Now, here's where Hayes's reputation for cool under pressure really showed. Any normal person in this situation would have panicked, started shooting wildly, wasted all their ammunition in the first 30 seconds. But Hayes didn't fire a single shot at first. He waited. The Comanche, seeing their prey cornered, decided to be patient too. They spread out around the base of the rock and took up positions, started firing at him from different angles, trying to find a way to get at him without exposing themselves too much. Hayes just sat there, watching, conserving his ammunition. He had a couple of advantages they didn't know about. First, the Colt Patterson revolver on his hip. This was a relatively new weapon, 5 shots without reloading, way more firepower than the single-shot rifles most people carried. Second, he had another Colt in his other holster, 10 shots total before he'd have to reload. And third, Jack Hayes was, by all accounts, one of the best shots in Texas. The standoff went on for hours. Every time a warrior tried to rush his position, Hayes would let them get close, real close, then fire once. Just once. The warrior would go down. The others would pull back. He didn't waste bullets on long shots, didn't panic when they got near, just waited until he had a clear target and took it. One of the Comanche chiefs later told people what his warriors thought during that fight. They couldn't figure it out. This one small man in a crack in the rock, holding off 30 of them. He should have been dead 10 times over, but every time they attacked, another warrior fell. They started thinking maybe the spirits of Enchanted Rock were protecting him, that he had some kind of medicine they couldn't overcome. The truth was simpler. Jack Hayes was just very, very good at staying alive. Finally, after what must have felt like forever, Hayes heard something beautiful. Gunfire from the direction of the surveying party. His companions had heard the fight and were coming to help. The Comanche, seeing they were about to be caught between 2 forces, grabbed their wounded and disappeared into the hill country. Hayes climbed down from his crevice, probably on shaking legs though he'd never admit it, and met up with his friends. The Comanche didn't forget him. They gave him a name after that. Captain Yak, they called him, or Bravo Too Much, which translates roughly to too brave or stupidly brave, depending on how you read it. Coming from the Comanche, who valued courage above almost everything else, that was about the highest compliment you could get. Hayes went on to have a whole legendary career, fought in the Mexican-American War, became the first sheriff of San Francisco during the gold rush, made a fortune in California real estate, died peacefully in 1883 at the age of 66. But that day at Enchanted Rock stuck with him. Years later, he'd still talk about those hours wedged into the granite, watching warriors try to reach him, knowing one mistake meant a very bad death. It was, he said, the longest afternoon of his life. The Texas Rangers that Hayes belonged to were something new on the frontier. Not quite soldiers, not quite police. More like a loosely organized band of men who were crazy enough to ride out into Comanche territory and try to keep order. Most Rangers were young, teens and early 20s. They came from farms and small towns, looking for adventure or pay or both. The mortality rate was staggering. In some years, nearly half the Rangers who rode out didn't ride back. But the ones who survived long enough got good, really good. They learned to shoot from horseback, to track across rocky ground where footprints were invisible, to read the land the way the Comanche did, understanding where ambushes might hide and where water could be found. And they learned something else too. They learned to work with allies who knew the territory better than they ever would. The Delaware were one of those allied tribes. Originally from the East Coast, they'd been pushed westward over generations, eventually ending up in Texas. They had their own scores to settle with the Comanche and were happy to work with the Rangers as scouts and trackers. These Delaware scouts were something to see. They could follow a trail that seemed invisible, could tell from a broken twig how many hours ago someone passed, could navigate by stars and sun and subtle changes in the vegetation that most white men would never notice. The Rangers who worked with them came to respect them deeply, not in some abstract theoretical way, in the practical, you saved my life and I'll remember it way that the frontier demanded. Here's the thing about the frontier that I keep coming back to. Survival out there wasn't just about being tough or skilled or lucky. It was about knowing yourself, knowing what you were capable of under pressure, and trusting that knowledge when everything went sideways. Hayes trusted himself. That's why he didn't panic. That's why he picked his shots carefully instead of blazing away. He'd been in enough tight spots to know that calm was more valuable than courage. Same with Kit Carson, lying in the dirt while that Mexican soldier smoked his cigarette. Same with the men on Mule Hill, eating their horses and squeezing water from mud. They'd learned, through hard experience, that the worst thing you can do in a crisis is make it worse by panicking. Herman Lehman learned this too, not all at once, but gradually, over years of living with the Comanche. By his late teens, Herman had been in more dangerous situations than most people see in a lifetime. Raids that went wrong, hunts that turned deadly, encounters with rival tribes who wanted him dead for reasons that had nothing to do with him personally. But he'd also learned the quiet parts of survival, how to read the weather by watching clouds, how to find water in dry country by following the behavior of animals, how to start a fire without matches, using just sticks and patience and the right kind of tinder. The Comanche were masters at this stuff. They'd been surviving on the plains for generations. Every bit of knowledge was passed down from parent to child, uncle to nephew, elder to young warrior. How to tan a hide so it stayed soft, how to preserve meat for long journeys, how to move through territory without leaving obvious tracks. Herman soaked it all up. Not because he had to anymore, but because he wanted to. This knowledge felt important, valuable, like it connected him to something older and deeper than he'd ever known back on that Texas farm. There's detail from the Comanche way of life that I find kind of beautiful. When a boy came of age, he would go out alone into the wilderness for days. No food, no water, just himself and the land. He would wait for a vision, a message from the spirit world about who he was supposed to become. This wasn't some casual thing. It was deadly serious. Young men sometimes died out there from exposure or dehydration or just plain bad luck. The elders would point a boy toward a sacred place, usually a high point with a view of the surrounding country, and send him off alone, and then they would wait. Herman did this too, climbed to a high place, sat down, and waited. The first day wasn't so bad. Hunger was manageable. Thirst was a nuisance, but nothing more. He watched the shadows move across the plains as the sun tracked overhead, watched the hawks circling on the thermals, watched the grass ripple in patterns that looked almost like water. The second day was harder. His lips cracked. His throat felt like sandpaper. Hunger had become a dull ache that never went away. But he stayed. The elders had told him that the vision wouldn't come until he was empty, until all the distractions of the body had faded into background noise. By the third day, Herman wasn't sure what was real anymore. The landscape seemed to shimmer and shift. Shapes moved in his peripheral vision that vanished when he looked directly at them. His heartbeat sounded impossibly loud in his own ears, and then, somewhere between sleeping and waking, the vision finally came. A wolf, running free across the plains, tireless, unafraid, answering to no one. It looked at him with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of knowledge, and then it was gone. Herman came back from that experience different, more sure of himself. The last traces of the scared 11-year-old farm boy had finally disappeared. In his place was someone new, someone who belonged to this land in a way that most white men never would. The older warriors treated him differently after that. He wasn't a captive anymore, not really. He wasn't even an adopted son. He was just one of them, a Comanche warrior with his own medicine, his own vision, his own place in the tribe. The night sky over Texas is something else. Miles from any electric light, you can see the Milky Way stretching from one horizon to the other. Stars so thick they seem to overlap. The occasional streak of a meteor burning up in the atmosphere. Herman would lie on his back sometimes and just watch the sky for hours, thinking about things. Not worried thoughts, just thoughts about where he'd been, where he was going, what any of it meant. The Comanche believed that the stars were the campfires of their ancestors, that when you died, you joined them up there, became part of that great river of light. It was a comforting thought. The idea that death wasn't an ending, just a change of location. Sometimes, on quiet nights like this, Herman could almost feel those ancestors watching, not judging, just present, part of the same unbroken chain of survival that stretched back through generations. The fire in the lodge has burned down to orange coals. Outside, the prairie grass is rustling in a gentle wind. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird is calling. One of those sounds that could put you to sleep if you let it. The Texas frontier wasn't just violence and survival and death, though there was plenty of all that. It was also this: quiet nights, warm fires, the simple pleasure of being alive after another day when being alive was not guaranteed. Herman pulled his buffalo robe tighter and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring whatever tomorrow brought. But right now, in this moment, everything was peaceful. The stars kept their slow wheel overhead. The wind kept whispering through the grass. And all across the frontier, in 1,000 different camps and cabins and forts, other people were falling asleep too, each one with their own story, their own struggles, their own small victories against the vast indifference of the wild. That's what survival really was in the end. Not the dramatic moments, though those happened too. It was all the quiet moments in between, the meals shared, the fires tended, the simple human act of lying down at night and trusting that you'd wake up in the morning. The coyotes were singing now, their voices rising and falling in that strange harmony that sounds mournful to some people and beautiful to others. Herman had come to love that sound. It meant the night was alive, that he was part of something larger than himself. Sleep came easy when you were tired enough, and on the frontier, everyone was always tired enough. The frontier had a way of throwing people together who would never have met otherwise. Men from completely different worlds, fighting side by side, depending on each other for survival. Take the Buffalo Soldiers. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States Army formed 4 regiments of black soldiers. Most of them were former slaves. They'd been given their freedom, and now they were being sent west to fight on the frontier. Same dangers as everyone else, same terrible conditions, same chances of dying badly in some lonely canyon or prairie. The name Buffalo Soldier probably came from the Cheyenne or the Comanche. There are different stories about why. Some say it was because of their hair, which reminded the warriors of buffalo fur. Others say it was because the army issued them buffalo hide coats to survive the plains winters. Either way, the name stuck. These men had something to prove. They knew it. Their officers knew it. And they proved it again and again in fights that would have broken a lot of other outfits. One of those soldiers was a man named Pompey Factor, born in 1849 to an escaped slave and a mother from the Biloxi tribe. His family had fled to Mexico for years, living in the mountains of northern Coahuila, before coming back to Texas after the Civil War ended. Factor knew the frontier as well as anyone. He'd grown up in wild country, learned to track and hunt and survive in places that would kill most people in a week. When he enlisted as a scout with the Buffalo Soldiers, he brought skills that the army desperately needed. September 1874, eastern Colorado. 6 men found themselves in one of those situations that the frontier seemed to specialize in. Surrounded, outgunned, and a long way from help. Factor was one of them. There was Billy Dixon, already famous for a shot he'd made at adobe walls a few months earlier. During that fight, he'd used a borrowed rifle to hit a Comanche chief from nearly a mile away. The bullet had knocked the man clean off his horse. After that, the attackers had pulled back, figuring maybe the spirits weren't on their side that day. Dixon was a civilian scout attached to the army. Alongside him were 4 soldiers and another scout named Amos Chapman. They'd been carrying messages across Comanche territory when they ran into a war party. Not just any war party. Over 100 Kiowa and Comanche warriors, moving fast and clearly looking for trouble. The 6 men had about 3 seconds to make a decision. They couldn't outrun that many mounted warriors, couldn't hide in terrain that was flat as a tabletop. Their only option was to fight. The first exchange of gunfire killed one of their horses and wounded Private George Smith so badly he couldn't move. The bullet had gone through his lung. He fell where he was hit, maybe 70 yards from where the others were taking cover. Now here's the thing. The soldiers thought Smith was dead. He wasn't moving, and with 100+ warriors circling, nobody could get to him to check, so they left him lying there in the grass and focused on staying alive themselves. They found a buffalo wallow, just a shallow depression in the prairie where the buffalo like to roll around in the dirt, maybe 10 feet across. Not much cover, but better than nothing. The men dove in and started digging with their hands and their knives, piling up the soft earth around the edges, trying to make some kind of barricade while arrows and bullets kicked up dirt all around them. Amos Chapman got hit. A bullet shattered his leg below the knee. He called out to Billy Dixon that he was wounded, that he couldn't walk. Dixon made a decision right then that probably should have gotten him killed. He ran out of that wallow, across 70 yards of open ground with 100 warriors watching, picked Chapman up and carried him back. Chapman was a bigger man than Dixon, heavy, dead weight. Dixon got him to the wallow anyway. Then someone realized that Private Smith, lying out there in the grass, was still alive. They could see him moving slightly, just barely, but moving. Private Peter Rath volunteered to go get him. Same deal as Dixon. Open ground, no cover, warriors everywhere. Rath ran out, confirmed Smith was breathing, and together with Dixon dragged the wounded man back to the wallow. Smith was in bad shape. That bullet through his lung was killing him slowly. But at least he wasn't dying alone out there in the grass. For the next several hours, those 6 men held off over 100 attackers. The Kiowa and Comanche would charge in waves, and the soldiers would drive them back with disciplined rifle fire. They weren't spraying bullets everywhere. They were picking their shots, making every round count because they knew they might run out of ammunition before the enemy ran out of patience. Then the weather changed. A cold front came through, dropping the temperature and bringing a hard rain. The buffalo wallow, which had been their salvation, started filling with water. 2 inches of brown, muddy water mixing with blood from the wounded men. The cold was brutal. These men had no coats, no blankets, nothing but their thin shirts and the clothes on their backs. They spent that night huddled in the mud, in the rain, shivering uncontrollably, with enemies surrounding them and their friends slowly dying. Chapman's shattered leg was starting to turn bad. Even in the dim light they could see it swelling. He didn't complain though, just sat there in the mud and water, teeth chattering, trying to stay conscious. At one point during the night, one of the men asked Chapman if he thought they'd make it out. Chapman said something that stuck with the others for the rest of their lives. He said he'd been in worse spots than this, which was probably a lie, but a useful one. Private Smith didn't make it. He passed some time during the night still in that wallow, surrounded by men who'd risk their lives to bring him in. His last words were asking about his mother. They buried him right there in the mud before the sun came up, marked the grave as best they could, knowing they might never be able to find it again. At dawn, Billy Dixon crawled out of the wallow and started walking. Someone had to get help, and he was the only one in good enough shape to try. He made it about half a mile before he ran into an army supply column that had been looking for them. When the relief force reached the wallow, they found the survivors in rough shape. Amos Chapman's leg was so badly damaged it had to be amputated later. But they were alive. Against all odds, most of them were alive. All 6 men who fought in that wallow received the Medal of Honor, even Private Smith, who didn't survive the night. The army wanted people to know what those men had done, what they'd endured. The Buffalo Soldiers kept serving on the frontier for decades after that, fought in dozens of engagements, earned 18 Medals of Honor altogether, and slowly, grudgingly, earned the respect of people who'd started out thinking they couldn't do the job. That's what the frontier did to people's prejudices. It didn't care what colour you were or where you came from. It just asked one question: can you survive? If you could, you belonged. If you couldn't, well, the land had ways of settling that issue permanently. By the time of the Buffalo Wallow fight, Herman Lehman was in his early 20s. He'd been living as a Comanche for over a decade. The scared farm boy was long gone. In his place was a warrior who'd participated in countless raids, hunted buffalo across the staked plains, and earned his place in the tribe through blood and skill. But things were changing. Even out on the plains, you could feel it. The buffalo herds were getting smaller. Every year there seemed to be fewer of them. White hunters were killing them by the thousands, taking the hides and leaving the meat to rot on the prairie. It was like watching a slow-motion disaster. The Comanche depended on those animals for everything: food, clothing, shelter, tools. Without the buffalo, their whole way of life would collapse. Herman had seen the killing grounds, miles of prairie covered with rotting carcasses. The smell was indescribable. Buzzards so thick they blocked out the sun. And for what? Hides that would be shipped back east to make leather belts and machine parts. The meat just left there to spoil. It made no sense to the Comanche. When they killed a buffalo, they used everything. The meat for food. The hide for clothing and teepees, the bones for tools and weapons, the sinew for thread and bowstrings. Nothing was wasted, nothing was left behind. But these white hunters didn't think that way. They took what they wanted and moved on, and every buffalo they killed was one less that the tribes could use to survive, and the soldiers kept coming. More forts, more patrols, more pressure from every direction. The old hunting grounds were shrinking. Places that had been safe for generations were now dangerous. Trails that the Comanche had used for centuries were now watched by cavalry patrols. The Red River War had been raging for months now, soldiers pushing deeper and deeper into Comanche territory, destroying winter camps, killing horses by the hundreds so the warriors couldn't ride. It was a different kind of warfare than the Comanche were used to. Not raids and counter-raids, something more systematic, more final. Herman could see where this was heading. Even if nobody said it out loud, everyone knew. The free life they'd been living couldn't last forever. The question was just how long they could hold on. How many more winters? How many more hunts? How many more nights under the stars before everything changed? There were discussions around the fires at night, quiet conversations about what to do. Some of the younger warriors wanted to fight harder, make the white men pay such a high price that they'd leave the plains alone. Others, usually the older ones, talked about making peace, finding some way to survive in this new world that was coming whether they wanted it or not. Herman didn't know where he stood. Part of him wanted to fight. That was the part that had become Comanche, that had drunk wolf blood and counted coup and earned his place through violence. But another part of him, some remnant of that farm boy from Mason County, understood that you can't fight forever. At some point, you have to figure out how to live. The stars were different this time of year, different constellations rising in the east. The Comanche had names for all of them, stories about how they got there. Herman knew those stories now as well as any story from his childhood, maybe better. He'd tried to remember things from before sometimes, his mother's face, the layout of the farmhouse, the names of his siblings. But it was all fading, like a dream you try to hold on to after waking. The details just kept slipping away. Was that sad? He wasn't sure. It was just how things were. You became who you needed to become to survive. And the person he'd been before wasn't who he needed to be anymore. The fire crackled softly. Somewhere nearby, a horse shifted and snorted. The sounds of the camp settling in for the night. Familiar sounds, comfortable sounds. Whatever was coming, it wasn't here yet. Tonight, there was warmth and shelter, and the quiet company of people he'd come to love. Tomorrow would bring its own problems. That was something else the frontier taught. You. Don't borrow trouble from the future. You've got enough to deal with right now. The Comanche understood this better than most. They lived in the present in a way that most white people couldn't. Each day complete in itself. Each night a small victory against everything that wanted you dead. The wind had died down to almost nothing. The air was still and cool, carrying the smell of wood smoke and prairie grass. If you listened carefully, you could hear the creek that ran nearby, water moving over stones in that endless soft murmur. Frogs were singing somewhere in the darkness, that two-note call that sounds like a question being asked over and over. Herman pulled his blanket tighter and watched the fire burn down. The flames were hypnotic in their own way, always moving, always changing, but somehow always the same, like the prairie itself, like life on the frontier. You could look at the same grassland 100 times and see something different each time. The angle of the light, the direction of the wind, the particular shade of gold the grass turned in autumn. You could lose yourself in a fire like that. Let your thoughts drift wherever they wanted to go. Not worrying about the past or the future, just being present in this moment, in this place, with these people. The Comanche believed that fire was sacred, a gift from the spirits that made human life possible. Without it, the nights would be cold and dark and dangerous. With it, you could push back the darkness, create a circle of warmth and light in the middle of the vast empty prairie. Herman understood that now in a way he never would have as a child. Fire wasn't just useful, it was a kind of miracle. Every time you struck a spark and nursed it into flame, you were participating in something ancient and essential. The last of the flames flickered and went out, leaving only coals, orange and red and fading slowly to grey. The stars seemed brighter now, with no firelight competing with them. One by one, the sounds of the camp faded into silence. Dogs stopped barking. Children stopped murmuring in their sleep. Even the horses seemed to settle into a deeper rest. Just the wind and the creek and the endless sky. Herman closed his eyes and let himself drift. Tomorrow would come soon enough. But for now there was only this, warmth and darkness and the slow breathing of people he loved. The frontier asked hard questions of everyone who came to it, but it also offered something in return. Moments of perfect peace. Nights so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. The knowledge that you were alive, truly alive, in a way that people in cities could never understand. That was worth something. Maybe it was worth everything. Sleep came like the tide coming in, slow and inevitable, carrying him away from the waking world into dreams he wouldn't remember. The stars kept their ancient watch. The creek kept singing its quiet song, and the prairie, vast and dark and patient, held all its secrets close. September 1868, eastern Colorado. The plains stretch out flat and golden under a late summer sky, and somewhere out there, a Cheyenne warrior named Roman Nose is about to ride into a fight he knows will kill him. Roman Nose was 45 years old. He'd been fighting white soldiers and settlers for decades, countless battles, countless raids, and in all that time, through all that violence, he'd never been seriously wounded. not once. His people believed he was protected by powerful medicine, specifically by his war bonnet. This wasn't just any headdress. It had been made for him by a Lakota holy man named White Bull in a ceremony that took days to complete. The bonnet was unlike anything else on the plains, single buffalo horn rising from the center of the forehead, not the usual pair on the sides. A tail made from a strip of young buffalo hide so long it touched the ground, even when Roman Nose was mounted on horseback. 40 eagle feathers, alternating 4 red then 4 black, running down its entire length. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The medicine was, by all accounts, even more so. White Bull had given Roman Nose specific instructions when he presented the bonnet. The headdress would protect him from the white man's bullets. He could ride into any battle, face any enemy, and the bullets would pass around him like water around a stone. But only if he followed certain rules. The most important one? He could never eat food that had been prepared with metal utensils. Iron was the white man's medicine. It would cancel out the protection of the bonnet. For 8 years, Roman Nose followed this rule without fail. At feasts, he would ask how the food was prepared. On raids, he would eat only what he knew was safe. 8 years of fighting, 8 years of bullets flying past him, around him, somehow never finding their mark. Warriors who rode beside him were cut down. He rode on. His reputation grew until he was one of the most feared names on the entire frontier. Then, on the night of September 16th, it all went wrong. Roman Nose was camped with a large war party of Cheyenne, Sioux, and Arapaho warriors. They'd spotted a small group of army scouts nearby. Easy pickings, they figured. Attack at dawn, wipe them out, take their horses and weapons. A Sioux woman was cooking for the camp that night. She served Roman Nose his meal, fry bread, freshly made. He ate it without thinking. It wasn't until after he'd finished that one of the other warriors noticed. The woman had used a metal fork to turn the bread while cooking. Roman Nose had eaten food touched by iron. You could argue it was just superstition. But here's the thing about belief. It doesn't matter if it's objectively true. What matters is whether you think it's true. And Roman Nose absolutely believed his medicine was now broken. He sat there for a long moment, processing what had happened. The ceremony to restore the war. Bonnet's power would take days, days he didn't have, because the attack was planned for morning. "I will die today," he told the warriors around him, "but I will go anyway." Meanwhile, about 12 miles away, a group of 50 Army scouts and soldiers were making camp near the Aracari Fork of the Republican River. They were led by Major George Forsyth, a Civil War veteran who'd fought at Gettysburg and in the Shenandoah Valley. His second in command was Lieutenant Frederick Beecher, whose uncle was the famous abolitionist preacher Henry Ward Beecher. These weren't regular army troops. They were a special unit, hand-picked for frontier fighting, experienced men, good shots, armed with Spencer repeating rifles that could fire 7 rounds without reloading. They had no idea that several hundred warriors were watching them from the surrounding hills. At dawn on September 17th, the attack began. The first warning was a thundering sound from the west. The scouts looked up to see their horses stampeding toward them, driven by mounted warriors. Then war cries from every direction, then arrows and bullets cutting through the morning air. Forsyth made a quick decision. There was a small sandbar island in the middle of the shallow river, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. Not much, but it was the only cover available. "Get to the island," he shouted. "Dig in." The men splashed across the knee-deep water and threw themselves onto the sand. They started digging with their hands, their knives, anything they could find, piling up sand around the edges, trying to create some kind of defensive position, while bullets kicked up dirt all around them. The horses that hadn't stampeded were killed in the first few minutes. The men pulled the bodies into a rough circle, using them as barricades. Not ideal, but dead horses stop bullets better than sand. The attacks came in waves, warriors charging in on horseback, firing, then wheeling away. Each charge got a little closer. Each charge took a few more men down. Lieutenant Beecher took a bullet to the spine early in the fight. He was paralyzed from the waist down but kept shooting from where he lay. The surgeon, Dr. Moores, took a bullet to the head and died instantly. Major Forsyth himself was hit 3 times. Once in the right thigh, dangerously close to the femoral artery. Once in the left leg. Once in the head, a grazing wound that left him dizzy and bleeding. But they held. The Spencer repeaters made a difference. The warriors expected the old single-shot rifles, where you had to reload after every shot. That pause, that vulnerability, was when they'd learned to charge and overwhelm their enemies. But these rifles kept firing. 7 shots, reload, 7 more shots. The warriors couldn't get close enough to finish the job. By mid-afternoon, Roman Nose was still watching from the hills. He'd stayed back all day, not from fear, but because he knew what would happen when he joined the fight. Other warriors had started to notice, started to whisper. Then an old Cheyenne woman confronted him directly, called him a coward, said young men were dying while he sat and watched. Roman Nose stood up, put on his war bonnet, painted his face and body for battle. He mounted his horse and rode down toward the island, gathering other warriors as he went. The men on the island saw him coming. They recognized the famous headdress. "This is it," one of them said. "Here comes Roman Nose." The charge was everything the Cheyenne were known for. Full speed, no hesitation. Roman Nose at the front, leading his warriors directly into the rifle fire. The scouts held their shots until the attackers were 50 yards away. Then they let loose. Roman Nose took a bullet to the spine. He stayed mounted for a few more seconds, then slid off his horse. His warriors carried him back to the village, where he died that night, just as he'd predicted. But the scouts were still trapped. By sunset on that first day, 4 men were dead and another 18 were wounded. They had almost no water. The river was contaminated with blood and the contents of dead horses' intestines. They had almost no food. Their ammunition was running low, and hundreds of warriors still surrounded them. That night, Forsyth asked for volunteers to slip out and go for help. Fort Wallace was 70 miles away, 70 miles of open prairie crawling with hostile warriors. 2 men volunteered, a 19-year-old scout named Jack Stillwell and an old French-Canadian trapper named Pierre Trudeau. They left after midnight, walking backward through the shallow water to confuse anyone tracking them. The second day was worse than the first. More attacks, more men wounded. The dead horses started to bloat and rot in the sun. The smell was indescribable. At some point that day, Lieutenant Beecher called out from where he lay paralyzed in the sand. Major Forsyth crawled over to him. "I have my death wound, General," Beecher said. "I am shot in the side and dying." "No, Beecher, no," Forsyth said. "Yes, good night." His last words, barely audible, were "my poor mother." He was 27 years old. The siege went on for 8 days. 8 days. Think about that for a second. 8 days trapped on a sandbar no bigger than a living room, surrounded by enemies who wanted you dead. 8 days with almost no food, almost no clean water, and wounds that were starting to go bad in the heat. The horse meat was their only food. At first it wasn't so terrible. Tough, but edible. By day 3 it had started to turn, green around the edges, a smell that made your eyes water. But they ate it anyway, because the alternative was starving. The water situation was worse. The river was shallow and slow-moving, and it was now contaminated with everything you'd expect when 50 horses die and rot in the summer sun. Blood, intestinal contents. The men dug holes in the sand, trying to filter some of the worst of it out. What they got was still foul, still made some of them sick. But they drank it anyway, because the alternative was dying of thirst. The wounded suffered most. Bullet wounds attract flies. Infection sets in fast in summer heat. Men lay in the sand, delirious with fever, calling out for water that wasn't fit to drink and food that was barely fit for dogs. Forsyth's leg wound became infected. The bullet was lodged near his femoral artery, and no one had the surgical skill to remove it safely. So Forsyth did it himself, with a razor, without anesthesia. He bit down on a stick, cut into his own flesh, and dug the bullet out while his men watched. He survived. Somehow. On day 3, Forsyth sent out 2 more runners, John Donovan and Alison Pilley. More volunteers walking into the unknown, knowing capture meant torture and death. By day 6, most of the men had given up hope. The runners were probably dead. No help was coming. They'd die here, on this stinking sandbar, and the coyotes would scatter their bones. Then, on September 25th, 8 days after the first attack, the survivors heard hoofbeats. They grabbed their rifles, ready for one last fight. A voice called out through the morning mist, "Hold your fire, we're Americans." It was the 10th Cavalry, Buffalo Soldiers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Carpenter. They'd received word from the runners, who'd actually made it to Fort Wallace and ridden out immediately. The scene that greeted them was something out of a nightmare. 50 dead horses, rotting in piles around a sandbar, 5 dead men, 18 wounded. The survivors gaunt, filthy, covered in flies and blood. The island would later be named Beecher Island, after the lieutenant who died there. All 6 of the men who volunteered as runners during the siege, including Stilwell and Trudeau, survived. All 4 runners and the 2 scouts who fought at the island received the Medal of Honor. As for Roman Nose, his body was placed on a funeral scaffold in the traditional Cheyenne way, left for the elements and the animals to reclaim. His exact burial place has been lost to history. The thing about Roman Nose's story that stays with me is the conviction. He truly believed that eating food touched by a metal fork had sealed his fate, and maybe that belief is what actually killed him. Not the bullet, but the certainty that the bullet would come, that his protection was gone, that there was no point in being careful anymore. Or maybe it was just a bullet, and the fork had nothing to do with it. We can't know. We can never know what would have happened if that Sioux woman had used a wooden spoon instead. If Roman Nose had gone into that fight still believing he was invulnerable. But here's what I do know. Belief is powerful. What we think is true shapes what we do, and what we do shapes what happens to us. Roman Nose believed he would die, and he charged straight into enemy fire. Would a man who believed he was protected have done the same thing? Questions without answers. The frontier was full of them. Back in Texas, the news of Beecher Island spread quickly. The death of Roman Nose was celebrated in white settlements and mourned in Cheyenne camps. It was another turning point in a war that had been grinding on for decades. Herman Lehmann, still living with the Comanche at this point, would have heard about it. The warrior network on the plains was surprisingly efficient. News travelled from tribe to tribe, camp to camp. He would have understood what it meant. Another great warrior fallen, another sign that the old ways were ending. The army had new weapons, new tactics, new determination. The repeating rifles at Beecher Island had changed everything. But that understanding wouldn't have made Herman want to leave. Not yet. He was still Comanche in his heart, still part of the only family he remembered, still riding free across the plains under the endless Texas sky. The end was coming. Everyone could feel it. But it hadn't arrived yet. And until it did, life went on. The hunts continued. The raids continued. The fires still burned at night, and the old men still told their stories, and the children still played their games in the dust between the lodges. Herman was part of that world, part of its rhythms, part of its dying light. He didn't know yet that he'd live to see it all end, that he'd watch the last free Comanche ride into Fort Sill and surrender, that he'd eventually go back to the white world and try to build a new life from the pieces of his old one. All of that was still in the future. For now there was just the present, the warmth of the fire, the sound of horses shifting in the darkness, the infinite stars overhead, the same stars that Roman Nose had seen on his last night alive, the same stars you can see tonight if you look up. The wind has died down now. The night is calm and quiet. Somewhere out there coyotes are starting their evening songs, that high, wavering sound that can seem lonely or beautiful, depending on your mood. Maybe a little of both. Your bed is warm. Your blankets are pulled up just right. The world outside your window is peaceful, and you are safe, and there's nothing you need to do right now except rest. Tomorrow will come on its own. The stories will still be here. The history will still matter. But for now, just let yourself drift. Let the images fade. Let the names and dates and battles become distant, like stars that are already setting below the horizon. Sleep is coming. You can feel it, that heaviness in your limbs, that softness behind your eyes. Let it come. June 1875, Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Quanah Parker rode in with his band on a hot summer day, the last free Comanche on the southern plains. They came slowly, deliberately, their horses thin from months of running and hiding. No fanfare, no dramatics, just a long line of tired people finally admitting what they'd known for a while now. It was over. Herman was with them, had been with them for nearly 6 years, more than a third of his life at that point. He sat on his horse and watched the fort grow larger as they approached, the American flag snapping in the wind, the neat rows of buildings, soldiers in blue uniforms watching from the walls. This was his future now, whatever that meant. The surrender itself was almost anticlimactic. They handed over their weapons, their horses were taken, they were assigned to camps on the reservation, told where they could go and where they couldn't. Rules on top of rules, a whole different kind of life. Quanah handled it with dignity. He'd been fighting the army his whole adult life, but he knew when a fight was finished. There'd be time later to figure out how to live in this new world. For now, the important thing was keeping his people alive. Herman didn't know what to feel. Part of him was relieved. The running and hiding, the constant looking over your shoulder, that had been exhausting. At least now they could stop. But another part of him, the part that had learned to love the freedom of the plains, felt like something essential had been amputated, like he was less than he'd been the day before. The first weeks on the reservation were strange, disorienting. The Comanche had always moved with the seasons, following the buffalo, going where the land told them to go. Now they were supposed to stay in one place, farm, raise cattle, live in houses instead of teepees. The government agents meant well, some of them anyway. They genuinely believed they were helping, teaching the Indians to be civilized, giving them a chance at a better life. They couldn't understand why people who'd been free might not see confinement as an improvement. The rations were barely enough, beef mostly, issued once a week. Nothing like the buffalo that had sustained them for generations. The meat was stringy, tough, wrong somehow. But it was food, and food was food when you were hungry enough. Some of the younger Comanche adapted quickly. They'd grown up during the hard years, when the buffalo were already scarce and the army was always pressing in. For them, the reservation was just another change in a life that had been nothing but changes. It didn't feel right. None of it felt right. Herman spent a lot of time walking the boundaries of the reservation, not trying to escape exactly, just needing to move, needing to feel his legs working, his body doing something other than sitting still. The guards watched him but didn't interfere. A lot of the former warriors did the same thing, walking the edges of their cage like animals at a menagerie. The land here wasn't so different from the Texas plains he'd grown up on, but it felt different, smaller somehow, hemmed in. You could see for miles, but you couldn't go for miles. That made all the difference. At night he'd lie awake and listen to sounds that weren't there anymore. No war parties preparing to ride, no buffalo calling in the distance, just the strange quiet of a people who'd lost their purpose. The older warriors took it hardest. Men who'd spent their entire lives raiding and hunting and fighting. Now they were supposed to do what? Grow corn. It wasn't just the activity they'd lost. It was the whole meaning of their existence. Some of them just gave up, stopped eating, stopped talking, faded away like they'd already died and just hadn't gotten around to lying down yet. Others adapted. Quanah was good at that. He figured out pretty quickly that the old rules didn't apply anymore, and new rules meant new opportunities. He learned to negotiate with the government agents, to speak English when it was useful, to play the new game while keeping as much of the old ways alive as he could. Herman watched and learned. That's what he'd always done. Watch and learn. It's how he'd survived as a captured 11-year-old. It's how he'd become a warrior. And now it's how he'd figure out whatever came next. But here's the thing. Herman wasn't really Comanche. He never had been, no matter how much he'd committed to the life. Somewhere out there in Texas, he had a family, a mother, siblings, people who might still be alive despite what Carnivist had told him all those years ago. He started thinking about that more and more. What if they were still out there? What if they were wondering about him? What if there was another life waiting, if he had the courage to reach for it? The army knew about Herman, knew he was a white captive who'd been living with a Comanche. They started asking questions, started pushing for him to go back to his own people, as if it were that simple, as if you could just decide to be someone different than who you'd become. But the pressure kept building, and Herman had to admit, to himself at least, that he was curious. He barely remembered his mother's face anymore, couldn't recall the layout of the farmhouse, but somewhere deep down there was still a connection, a thread that hadn't quite snapped. In 1878, Herman agreed to go back. The army provided an escort, a couple of soldiers who looked almost as uncomfortable as Herman felt. They travelled by wagon, then by train for part of it. Herman had never been on a train before. The noise, the speed, the strange vibration of the rails, it all felt wrong, unnatural, like the world was moving too fast and he couldn't keep up. The journey to Texas took several days, travelling through country he'd raided, past settlements he'd helped attack. The landscape looked familiar and foreign at the same time, like a dream you can't quite place. Towns had sprung up where there'd been nothing. Fences crossed land that had been open range. Everything was being carved up, divided, claimed. Herman stared out the window and tried to reconcile what he was seeing with his memories. This was his homeland, the place he'd been born, but it felt more alien than the plains ever had. At least on the plains the rules made sense. Out here, among the settlers and their fences and their endless subdivisions, he couldn't figure out what the rules even were. His mother was still alive, Augusta Buchmeier, though she'd aged more than the years alone could explain. The army had sent word ahead, so she knew he was coming. She'd been waiting on the porch since dawn, they told him later. Couldn't sit still, couldn't do anything but wait. When Herman walked into her yard, she didn't recognize him at first. This tall, sun-darkened man with long hair and strange mannerisms, speaking English with an accent that wasn't quite right. His posture was different. His eyes were different. Everything about him had been reshaped by the years. Then something clicked. She saw something in his eyes. Something that had survived everything else. The reunion was emotional, overwhelming. Years of grief suddenly undone. Augusta had never stopped hoping, never stopped believing her son might somehow come back. And here he was, changed beyond recognition. But here, Herman's siblings gathered, the ones who'd survived anyway. They stared at their brother like he was a ghost, which in a way he was. The boy they'd known had died years ago. This man wearing his face was someone else entirely. The first weeks were awkward. Herman didn't know how to act in a house with walls and floors and furniture. He slept on the ground outside because beds felt too soft, too confining. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced he was under attack. He didn't know how to eat at a table, didn't understand the rhythms of farm life, didn't get the jokes or the references or the casual assumptions that everyone else took for granted, and people stared, all the time, the neighbours, the townspeople, everyone who'd heard the story. They wanted to see the boy who'd lived with savages, who'd gone native, who'd come back from the dead. Herman hated being stared at, hated being treated like a curiosity, but he also understood. If the situation were reversed, he'd probably stare too. Slowly, painfully, he started to adapt. Again. The same process he'd gone through as a child, just in reverse, learning new customs, new expectations, a new way of being in the world. He cut his hair, put on American clothes, started working on the farm, tried to remember what it felt like to be Herman Lehmann, the Texas boy, instead of the Comanche warrior he'd become. It didn't quite work, not fully. You can't just erase years of your life, can't forget skills your body has learned so deeply they've become instinct. Sometimes he'd catch himself doing things the Comanche way, things that made his family nervous. Sometimes he'd dream in Comanche and wake up confused about where he was, but he kept trying, for his mother's sake, if nothing else. She'd waited so long, hoped so hard. The least he could do was try. The nights were the hardest. That's when the old life called to him strongest. He'd lie in bed and remember the stars over the plains, the smell of campfires, the sound of horses and wind and distance, a whole world that existed only in his memory now. He wondered about the friends he'd left behind, the warriors he'd ridden with, Quanah and the others, stuck on that reservation, trying to build new lives out of the wreckage of the old ones. Were they thinking about him too? Or had they already moved on, the way you have to move on when everything changes? The Texas sky at night wasn't so different from the Oklahoma sky or the Comanche sky. Same stars, same moon, same vast darkness that made you feel small and safe at the same time. Herman would sit on the porch sometimes after everyone else was asleep and just look up, letting his mind empty, letting the peace of the night seep in. His mother worried about him. He could tell. She'd catch him staring at nothing, lost in thoughts he couldn't or wouldn't explain. She'd ask if he was okay, and he'd say yes, but they both knew it was more complicated than that. How do you explain to someone who's never experienced it? The way a place and a people can get inside you. The way survival rewrites who you are. The way you can belong to two worlds and neither one at the same time. You don't explain it. You just live with it, day by day, finding small comforts where you can. There was a creek near the farm, nothing special, just a little trickle of water moving through the Texas hill country. Herman would go there sometimes, sit on the bank and listen to the water and pretend, just for a moment, that he was back on the plains. The sound of water moving over rocks, the same in Texas as it was anywhere. That gentle, endless murmur that seems to say, everything's okay, everything keeps going, even when it feels like the world has ended. He'd close his eyes and let the sound wash over him, let it smooth away the rough edges of the day, the awkward conversations, the staring neighbours, the constant effort of trying to be someone he wasn't sure he remembered how to be. The creek didn't care about any of that. It just kept flowing, just kept making its quiet music, just kept being what it was. Maybe that was the secret, Herman thought. Maybe you didn't have to figure everything out. Maybe you just had to keep going, like the water, keep moving, keep finding your way around the obstacles, keep doing the best you could with what you had. The stars came out one by one as the light faded. Texas stars, Comanche stars, just stars really, indifferent to human categories and human troubles, burning away up there in the darkness the same way they'd been burning for millions of years. Herman let out a long, slow breath. The tension in his shoulders eased a little. The knot in his chest loosened. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more adjustments, more of the endless work of rebuilding a life. But tonight, there was just this, the creek and the stars and the soft, warm air of a Texas evening. His mother had told him something, one of those first days back. She'd said she'd prayed for him every single night he was gone, every single night for 8 years, that she'd never given up believing she'd see him again. Herman didn't know what to do with that. The weight of someone's faith, the power of their hoping. It felt like a responsibility he wasn't sure he could live up to. But maybe he didn't have to live up to it. Maybe he just had to be here, present, alive. Maybe that was enough. The creek kept singing its quiet song. The stars kept their ancient watch. And Herman sat there in the darkness, somewhere between two worlds, trying to figure out how to be whole again. It would take time, maybe more time than he had. But for now, for this one quiet moment, he was okay. The night settled around him like a blanket, soft and dark and full of possibility. The frontier had shaped him, changed him, made him into something he never expected. But it hadn't destroyed him. He was still here, still breathing, still trying. A barn owl called from somewhere in the trees. that strange, wavering cry that sounds almost human if you're not expecting it. Herman had heard owls all his life, in 2 different lives now. The sound connected them somehow, a thread running through everything he'd been. The crickets were singing their endless chorus, tree frogs adding their higher notes, the whole night alive with small sounds that blended together into something like music, something like peace. His mother had left a lamp burning in the window for him, a small golden glow against the darkness. She did that every night, she'd told him, even when he was gone, especially when he was gone, keeping a light burning for the son she'd never stopped believing would come home. He looked at that light for a long time, thinking about what it meant, the hope it represented, the years of waiting and praying and refusing to give up. Maybe that was the real lesson of the frontier, not the survival skills or the fighting techniques or the hard-won knowledge of how to live in wild country. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just about not giving up, keeping a light burning even when there's no reason to believe anyone will ever see it. Herman stood up slowly, brushed the grass off his clothes, took one more look at the stars and the creek and the soft Texas night. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more adjustments, more of the endless work of finding his place in a world that had changed while he was gone. But tonight, there was a light waiting for him, and that, more than anything else, told him he was home. And on the frontier, whether you were talking about the wild plains or the strange new territory of coming home, that was everything. The years passed the way years do, slowly at first, then all at once. Herman Lehman stayed in Texas, got married eventually, had children of his own, worked, farms and ranches across the hill country, doing the kind of labor that would have been unthinkable to the warrior he'd once been, fixing fences, branding cattle, the quiet, repetitive work of making a living. He never fully fit in. People could tell there was something different about him, the way he moved, the way his eyes tracked movement at the edges of his vision, little habits that surfaced without him even noticing. He'd mount a horse from the right side instead of the left, the Comanche way. He'd squat instead of sit when he was thinking. He'd go quiet for long stretches, lost in memories nobody else could see. The neighbours got used to it eventually, stopped staring so much, started treating him like just another farmer, even if they never quite forgot his story. In small Texas towns, stories like that don't go away. They become part of the local folklore. Something people tell visitors. That's Herman Lehman over there, the one who lived with the Comanche. Quite a story. Herman let them talk. What else was he going to do? He stayed in touch with Quanah Parker, letters mostly, passed through the reservation system, sometimes visits, when he could manage them. The 2 men had a bond that went deeper than most friendships. They'd shared a world that no longer existed, had survived things that most people couldn't imagine. That creates a connection that doesn't fade with distance or time. When Herman visited the reservation, it was always bittersweet. Good to see old friends, good to speak Comanche again, to fall back into rhythms and customs that still felt more natural than the white ways. But hard too. Hard to see proud warriors living in small houses, farming patches of land that couldn't possibly sustain them. Hard to see children who'd never known the old life, who thought the reservation was just how things were. Quanah was doing well, all things considered. He'd become a leader on the reservation, a spokesman for his people. He learned to work with the government agents, to navigate the bureaucracy, to advocate for the Comanche within a system that had been designed to erase them. He even built a big house, A star house, they called it, with a star painted on the roof so his mother's ghost could find him if she ever came looking. The house had 11 rooms, enough space for his large family and for visitors who came from all over. Quanah had become famous in his own right. Presidents came to meet him. Teddy Roosevelt hunted wolves with him. He travelled to Washington to argue for better treatment of his people. But underneath all that, Herman could see Quanah was still the same man he'd ridden with, still carried the same grief for the old ways, still woke up some mornings expecting to hear horses and found only silence. His mother was Cynthia Ann Parker, a white woman who'd been captured as a child, just like Herman. She'd lived with the Comanche for decades, married a chief, had children. When the Texas Rangers recaptured her in 1860, she never recovered. Spent the rest of her life grieving for the family and the world that had been taken from her. Died of a broken heart, people said. Though maybe it was just influenza. Sometimes broken hearts and viruses work together. Quanah never stopped missing her. Never stopped thinking about what her life had been like, torn between two worlds just like Herman was now. Maybe that's part of why the two men understood each other so well. They'd both seen how complicated belonging could be. They'd both carried the weight of lives lived in between. The frontier was gone by then. Really gone, not just changed. The railroads crisscrossed the plains. The buffalo were extinct or close enough. The open range had been fenced and subdivided and turned into cattle country. You could travel from one end of Texas to the other without ever feeling like you'd left civilization. Herman watched all this happen, watched the wild country get tamed, inch by inch, year by year. It was like watching a friend grow old and fade away, not sudden, not dramatic, just a slow erosion of everything that had made the land feel alive. But the memories stayed sharp. Even decades later, Herman could close his eyes and be back on the plains, feel the horse beneath him, smell the sage and the grass and the distant promise of rain, hear the war cries and the thunder of hooves and the silence of the prairie at night. Those memories were a gift and a burden both. They connected him to something important, something real. But they also reminded him of everything he'd lost, the freedom, the wildness, the sense that anything was possible. His children grew up hearing stories, not all of them. Some things Herman kept to himself, but enough that they understood their father was different, that he'd lived a life most people only read about in books. They were proud of him, in their way, even if they didn't fully understand. By 1925, Herman was in his mid-60s, grey hair now, slower than he used to be, but still strong, still capable of things that surprised people who didn't know his history. That summer, a rodeo came to Mason County. The organizers had an idea. What if they got Herman Lehman to do a demonstration? Show people what Comanche hunting had looked like. It would be educational, historical, a connection to the past that was slipping away with every funeral. Herman thought about it for a while. Part of him resisted. The old ways were sacred, not entertainment, not something you put on for crowds of gawking strangers. But another part of him wanted people to see, wanted them to understand, even a little, what had been lost, what his other life had been like. He agreed. He hadn't done anything like this in years, decades really, but he remembered how. Some things you don't forget no matter how long it's been. Your body holds on to them, muscle memory deeper than thought. The day of the demonstration was hot, August in central Texas, which means heat that sits on you like a wet blanket. The rodeo grounds were packed with people, families with children, cowboys who'd driven in from ranches miles away, curious folks from all over the county who'd heard about the show, a few newspaper reporters, notebooks ready. Herman arrived wearing buckskin, the old clothes, or clothes made to look like them anyway. He'd put on a headdress too, full of feathers and beads and ribbons. Not the kind of thing he'd have worn for a real hunt, but people expected it. Part of the show, part of what they thought Indians looked like. Before he mounted up, he stood quietly for a moment, eyes closed, finding that place inside himself where the warrior still lived. The crowd noise faded, the heat faded, everything faded except the pulse of his own heart and the memory of wind on the plains. He rode in on a horse with no saddle, no bridle either, just a simple halter with a looped rein. The Comanche way. You guided the horse with your knees, your weight, your intention. Left your hands free for weapons. People in the crowd murmured. They'd never seen anyone ride like that. In the arena, they'd released a yearling calf, maybe 300 pounds, just standing there, confused by all the noise and attention. The crowd went quiet, waiting. Herman gave a war cry, not for show exactly, more like muscle memory, something that came up from deep inside and demanded to be let out. Then he kicked his horse into motion and the demonstration began. It was over in seconds. He rode the calf down, loosed an arrow into its heart, dismounted in one smooth motion, cut the throat to bleed it out, split open the belly, pulled out the liver, and ate it raw. Right there in the arena, blood on his hands and his face and dripping down his chin. The crowd didn't know what to do. Some people cheered, some people looked sick. Most just stared, trying to process what they'd seen. This grey-haired old man moving like something from another century, another world. Herman didn't really notice the crowd. He was somewhere else, back on the plains, back in his other life. For just a few minutes he'd been young again, wild again, free. After the demonstration, people came up to talk to him, shake his hand, ask questions. He answered politely enough, but his mind was still far away, still running with the hunt, still feeling the wind and the speed and the ancient thrill of the chase. That night, back at his house, Herman sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. Same stars he'd been watching his whole life. Same stars the Comanche had named and told stories about. Same stars that had guided hunters and warriors and travellers since the beginning of time. He thought about all the people he'd known who were gone now. Carnivist, the warriors he'd ridden with, his adopted family on the plains. Quanah was still alive, but getting old too. Their generation was fading. Soon there'd be no one left who remembered what the free life had been like. The night was warm and still. Crickets singing, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, the ordinary sounds of a Texas summer evening. So different from the plains, but also, in some ways, the same. Night sounds, life sounds, the world going on the way it always had. Herman's wife came out and sat beside him, didn't say anything, just sat there, keeping him company in the dark. She'd learned, over the years, that sometimes he needed to be quiet, to let his mind wander where it needed to go. He reached over and took her hand, squeezed it gently. This was his life now, this house, this porch, this woman, the children sleeping inside, the farm that needed tending tomorrow, ordinary things, small things, but precious too in their own way. The frontier had given him so much, strength, skills, stories that would outlast him, but it had taken things too. Years of his childhood, his innocence, his certainty about who he was and where he belonged. Maybe that was always the trade. You can't survive something without being changed by it, can't come through fire without bearing marks. The question wasn't whether you'd be different. The question was what you'd do with the difference. Herman had done his best, wasn't always sure it was enough, but he'd tried. Every day he'd tried to be a good husband, a good father, a good neighbour, to build something worth having out of the pieces left over from his wild years. The stars were bright tonight. No moon, so they had the sky to themselves. That great river of light stretching from one horizon to the other. Campfires of the ancestors, the Comanche said. All the people who'd come before, watching over all the people still here. Herman hoped that was true. Hoped his friends were up there somewhere, riding the sky the way they'd ridden the plains, free again, wild again, the way they'd been before everything changed. His eyes were getting heavy. The day had taken a lot out of him. The demonstration, the crowds, the memories stirred up like dust in a windstorm. He was tired in a way that went deeper than muscles and bones. His wife tugged gently on his hand. Time for bed. Tomorrow would come early, the way it always did. There'd be work to do, chores that needed doing, the endless rhythm of farm life. Herman stood up slowly, took one more look at the stars, then followed his wife inside, into the warm yellow light of the lamp she'd left burning in the window. The same kind of light his mother had burned for him all those years ago, a beacon in the darkness, a promise that someone was waiting. He thought about that sometimes, how lights in windows meant home, meant safety, meant someone cared whether you came back or not. The frontier hadn't had lights like that, just campfires that burned down to coals and went out. You made your own warmth out there, your own safety, your own reasons to keep going. But this was good too, this steady glow, this permanent welcome, something the wildlife couldn't offer. Herman climbed into bed beside his wife, felt the mattress settle under his weight. Still not as comfortable as the ground, if he were being honest. But he'd gotten used to it. You can get used to almost anything, given enough time. The house creaked and settled around them, old wood finding its nighttime voice. Outside, an owl called once, then went silent. The crickets kept up their chorus, steady and unchanging. Sleep came easier these days than it used to. The restless energy of youth had faded into something calmer, more patient. He didn't fight the darkness anymore. Just let it come. Let it wrap around him like a familiar blanket. He thought, sometimes, about all the nights he'd survived. All the times he'd lain down not knowing if he'd wake up. On the plains, during raids, in those first terrible days after being captured. Every morning had been a small miracle. Every sunrise proof that he was still here. Now sunrise was just sunrise, predictable, expected. Part of the ordinary rhythm of ordinary days. That was its own kind of miracle when you thought about it. The luxury of taking tomorrow for granted. His wife's breathing slowed beside him, even and deep, the sound of someone at peace. She'd been patient with him all these years, had learned to live with his silences and his strangeness, and his nights when the past pressed in too close. Not everyone would have stayed, but she had. Herman closed his eyes and let himself drift, not thinking about anything, not worrying about tomorrow, just floating in that warm space between waking and dreaming, that gentle borderland where everything softens and blurs. The last thing he was aware of was the wind, soft and steady outside the window, moving through the grass the way it had moved through grass for thousands of years, whispering secrets to anyone patient enough to listen, carrying sounds from far away or maybe from long ago. The difference didn't seem to matter much in that drowsy space. Then even that faded away, and there was only rest, deep and dreamless and complete. The kind of rest you earn by living fully, by surviving what needed surviving, by finding your way home, wherever home turned out to be. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly overhead. The wind kept whispering. The world kept turning. And Hermann Lehmann slept the sleep of someone who had finally, after all those years, found peace. Hermann Lehmann passed away in 1932. He was 72 years old, died in his bed, in his house, surrounded by family. A peaceful end for a man who'd lived through so much that wasn't peaceful at all. They buried him in a small cemetery in Loyal Valley, Texas, not far from where he'd been captured all those years ago. The land looked different now. Fences everywhere, roads, power lines, but the hills were the same hills. The sky was the same sky. Some things don't change, no matter how much time passes. A few months before he died, something interesting happened. A package arrived in the mail. Inside was a small golden spoon, beautifully made with an inscription on the handle. It read, Buffalo Hump Jr. Buffalo Hump had been a Comanche war chief, one of the most feared men on the Texas frontier in his time. He'd led raids that terrorized settlers from San Antonio to the Gulf Coast. In 1840, he'd led the Great Raid of Texas, sweeping through Victoria and Linville, making it all the way to the Gulf of Mexico before the Texans could organize a response. Hundreds of warriors moving like a storm across the landscape. But he'd also been a father, a leader, a man who cared about his people and their future. A man who understood by the end of his life that the old ways couldn't last. Who made peace with the government because fighting had become pointless. Who spent his final years trying to help his people survive in a world that had no place for them anymore. The spoon was a gift for Hermann's first grandchild, a gesture from across the old divide, from the people Hermann had once lived with to the family he'd built after leaving them. It meant something, that gift. An acknowledgement that the bonds formed on the frontier didn't break just because the frontier was gone. That somewhere in Oklahoma or Texas people still remembered, still cared. Hermann kept that spoon for the rest of his life, showed it to people sometimes when they asked about his years with the Comanche, proof that the relationships had been real, that he hadn't just been a captive, a prisoner. He'd been part of something, part of a people, part of a way of life that was gone now but had been real and beautiful in its time. Quanah Parker had died in 1911, 20 years before Hermann. His funeral was one of the largest ever held in Oklahoma. Thousands of people came, Comanche and white alike. They buried him next to his mother, Cynthia Ann, whose remains he'd had moved to Oklahoma so they could be together. On Quanah's gravestone they carved the words, "Resting here until day breaks and shadows fall and darkness disappears." A Christian sentiment for a man who'd spent his whole life between worlds, who'd been a warrior and a diplomat, a Comanche chief and an American celebrity, who'd never stopped being both things at once. Hermann understood that, the living between, the carrying of multiple selves inside one body. He'd spent 50 years doing it himself, never fully Comanche, never fully Texan, always somewhere in the complicated middle. Maybe that was the real legacy of the frontier, not the violence or the hardship, though there was plenty of both, but the mixing, the blending, the way people from completely different worlds could find common ground when survival demanded it. Kit Carson had died in 1868, only 48 years old, his body worn out by decades of hard living. They say his last words were asking for a pipe and a buffalo steak, the tastes of the trail. The things that had defined his life. He'd been a lot of things in his time: trapper, scout, soldier, Indian fighter. Some of those things look different now than they did then. History has a way of complicating heroes, but whatever else he was, Carson was a survivor. A man who found his way through situations that should have killed him, over and over, until his body finally said enough. Jack Hayes lived longer, made it to 66, died wealthy and respected in California, about as far from Enchanted Rock as you could get and still be in America. He'd been a ranger, a soldier, a sheriff, a businessman. Reinvented himself every time the world changed. That was its own kind of survival, knowing when to hold on and when to let go. The Buffalo Soldiers kept serving until 1951, over 80 years of distinguished service. They fought in the Indian Wars, the Spanish-American War, both world wars, earned dozens of medals of honor, proved again and again that courage doesn't care about the color of your skin. Billy Dixon, the scout from the Buffalo Wallow fight, lived until 1913. Spent his later years as a rancher in Oklahoma, not far from where he'd nearly died in that muddy hole in the ground. He wrote about his experiences sometimes, tried to help people understand what the frontier had been like, the terror and the beauty and the strange way those two things could exist side by side. Hannah Dustin's story became famous in her own time and stayed famous for centuries after. They put up statues of her, wrote books and poems about her escape. She became a symbol of frontier resilience, though what exactly she symbolized depended on who was doing the talking. She lived to 79, raised her surviving children, watched her grandchildren grow up, never talked much about what happened on that island in the Merrimack River. Some things you carry alone, some things don't have words. All these people scattered across 200 years of American history, different times, different places, different circumstances, but connected by something, a thread running through all their stories. Survival, not just staying alive, though that was part of it, but something deeper. The refusal to be destroyed by what happened to them. The insistence on finding meaning, finding purpose, finding a way forward even when forward seemed impossible. Kit Carson crawling barefoot through cactus country to save his stranded comrades. Jedediah Smith watching his entire trapping party massacred and somehow finding the strength to keep going. Jack Hayes wedged into a crevice on Enchanted Rock, cool as creek water while 30 warriors tried to kill him. The Buffalo Soldiers huddling in a muddy wallow, wounded and freezing, holding off 100 attackers through pure stubborn will. Hannah Dustin, 9 days after giving birth, walking through the snow after watching her baby murdered, making a plan, executing it, paddling home, down a frozen river with nothing but determination and a handful of scalps, and Herman, the farm boy who became a warrior, who lost one family and found another, who crossed back over and somehow built a life in between, who carried 2 worlds inside him until the day he died. Each of them faced moments when giving up would have been easier, when the sensible thing would have been to lie down and let the darkness take them, but they didn't. Something in them refused. Some spark that wouldn't go out no matter how hard the wind blew. The frontier tested everyone who came to it, settlers and natives alike. It didn't care about your plans or your hopes or your ideas about how life was supposed to go. It just asked one question, over and over: can you handle this? And if you couldn't, well, the land had ways of moving on without you. But the ones who could handle it, the ones who found their way through, they came out with something. Call it wisdom. Call it strength. Call it the deep knowledge that comes from being pushed to your limits and discovering you have more in you than you thought. Herman knew that knowledge, carried it with him every day of his life after leaving the plains. It was in his bones, in his muscles, in the way he moved through the world. You don't survive what he survived without being changed, without being, in some ways, enlarged. His children and grandchildren inherited some of that. Not the skills, exactly. Those were fading with every generation. But the stories, the sense that their family had been forged in something harder and wilder than the comfortable world they lived in. Stories matter. They're how we make sense of things, how we pass on what we've learned, how we connect to people and times we'll never meet. The story of the American frontier is complicated, full of violence and injustice and tragedy, full of people who did terrible things to each other. It's not a simple story, and it shouldn't be simplified, but it's also full of people like Herman Lehman, people who found themselves in impossible situations and somehow, against all odds, found their way through. People whose lives show us something about what humans are capable of. The cruelty, yes, but also the resilience, the adaptability, the stubborn refusal to give up. That's worth remembering, worth holding on to, not as nostalgia for a time that was in many ways brutal and unjust, but as a reminder that we're tougher than we think, that when everything falls apart, there's something in us that knows how to keep going. The night is quiet now. The stories are told. All those lives, all those struggles, all those moments of terror and triumph and ordinary endurance, they're part of the past now, part of the great river of history that flows on whether we pay attention to it or not. But they're also part of us, part of what made this country, part of the human story that stretches back to the beginning and forward to whatever comes next. Herman Lehman would be over 160 years old now if he'd lived. Hard to imagine. The world has changed so much since he walked it. Highways where there were trails, cities where there was prairie, the frontier long gone, paved over, built up, tamed. But some things don't change. The stars are the same stars he watched. The wind blows through grass the same way it always has. The deep human need for home and belonging and meaning, that's the same too. We're all surviving something. That's what it means to be alive, getting through the hard parts, finding joy in the good parts, making our way forward day by day into an unknown future. The frontier survivors knew this better than most. They'd been stripped down to the essentials, had learned through hard experience what really mattered. And what really mattered was simple. Stay alive. Take care of your people. Find moments of peace where you can. Tonight, wherever you are, you have those things. You're alive. You have people who care about you, even if they're far away. And you have this moment, this quiet, this rest. That's not nothing. That's everything. The night stretches out long and dark and full of stars. The same night that covered the plains when Herman rode across them. The same night that covered the New England forest when Hannah Dustin made her escape. The same night that has covered this earth since the beginning. There's comfort in that. In the bigness of it, in knowing that you're part of something that goes back further than memory and forward further than imagination. One small life in the great sweep of time, but precious for all that, irreplaceable. The moon is out there somewhere, doing what it's always done, pulling the tides, marking the months, watching over travellers and dreamers and all the restless souls who can't quite find their way to sleep. The Comanche used to track the seasons by the moon, Snow moon, budding moon, leaf moon, names that connected the sky to the earth, the stars to the grass, everything to everything else. We've lost some of that connection, living in our lit-up cities and our climate-controlled boxes. Lost the sense that we're part of the natural world, not separate from it. But the connection's still there if you look for it. Still there in the way your body knows when it's time to sleep. In the way the seasons still change whether you're paying attention or not. In the rhythm of days and nights that's been going on since long before humans existed and will keep going long after we're gone. The stories will keep. They've kept this long. Tomorrow or the next day or the day after, they'll still be there, waiting for someone to tell them again, to find meaning in them again, to connect with those long ago people who struggled and survived and somehow passed something on. Stories are how we defeat time, how we cheat death, a little bit anyway. Hermann Lehmann is gone, but his story is still here, still being told, still meaning something to people who never knew him and never could. That's a kind of immortality, maybe the only kind that really matters. But for now, rest. Let the night hold you the way it held all those people who came before. Let the quiet settle in like snow falling on a winter prairie. Soft, gentle, covering everything in stillness. Let your mind drift away from words and stories and thoughts into that soft, dark space where dreams begin. That place between waking and sleeping where everything becomes possible and nothing hurts anymore. You're safe here, warm, comfortable. All the dangers of the frontier are far away, in time if not in space. All the struggles of the day are behind you. All the worries of tomorrow can wait. They'll still be there in the morning. They always are. But for now, they're not your concern. Just this moment, just this breath, just the slow, easy slide into sleep. The wind whispers through the grass somewhere out there. Maybe it's the same wind that crossed the plains 150 years ago. Maybe wind doesn't care about time. Maybe it just keeps moving generation after generation, carrying whatever needs carrying. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, the same patterns the Comanche navigated by, the same patterns sailors have followed for thousands of years. They don't change, the stars, or they change so slowly it amounts to the same thing. You can count on them in a way you can't count on much else. Somewhere, in some other time, a young man rides across the plains under those same stars, free and wild and alive, not knowing what's coming, not knowing how the story ends, just riding, just being, just part of the great unfolding that none of us can see from the inside. And you, in your bed, in your home, in this quiet moment at the end of a long day, you're part of the same world, the same story, the same long human journey toward morning. The frontier is gone now, paved over, built up, tamed. But it's still there in the stories, still there in the blood of the people who descended from those survivors. Still there, maybe, in all of us. In that part of us that knows how to keep going when everything falls apart. That refuses to give up no matter what. You carry that too, whether you know it or not. The strength of all the people who came before you. The resilience, the stubbornness, the quiet courage that got them through and brought you here. Let go now. Let yourself sink into rest. Let the stories settle into your bones where they belong. The night is kind. The darkness is soft. The world is quiet and you are safe. Sleep well.